everyone. Today I have something kind of special to share with you. This is a commission, and I decided to accept it because for a long time, actually pretty much since the inception of this channel, I have been wanting to share some of my side of the music world with you as well. Not because I'm trying to convert you or anything, but because it's part of who I am, and it's part of how I ended up here. And I also think that many of you, I know that many of you already enjoy a good deal of classical music, and some of you are deeply versed in it just as much as you are rock music. Others of you have said to me, I wish I could enjoy classical music, but I don't really know how to get into it. I'm not saying that today I'll show you how to get into it, but today we are going to listen together to an iconic piece of classical music. And I think it's a perfect one for this channel because so much of rock music, not all, but a good deal of rock music is from Great Britain, right? Even to the point that we talk about the British invasion here in America, right? And this piece is deeply, deeply British, English. It's so anchored and so rooted in the English musical tradition. And I'll be talking about that along the way. I'm not going to make it a whole history lesson, but it's going to be fun. So today's piece of music is entitled Fantasia on a Theme of Thomas Tallis. And Thomas Tallis was a high Renaissance English composer. And this piece itself, this Fantasia, was composed by Vaughan-Williams, who was an early 20th century English composer. So here we're spanning basically the bulk of classical English music history. And it takes us up. Vaughan-Williams died just a couple years before the Beatles came on the scene. So it basically takes us up to the door of the Beatles, and of course there were others before the Beatles, but kind of right to that point. So I feel like this kind of catches it all, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So let's just dive in and listen. Okay, that first chord. It almost sounds like, if you're just hearing that first chord, you could almost imagine, if you're watching a movie and there's usually the trademark, the introduction, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and you have the lion roaring and that sort of thing. It sounds like it could be a chord that swells into that and then disappears into something else, right? But one of the things I want you to notice about this opening section is the way this first swelling chord just opens up into a swaying chord sequence with the strings, and it just wraps you up in it and carries you along with it. Single note there, carrying on. Okay, now what did those bass players just pluck out on their instrument? That is the first clue we have, the first introduction, the first hint of this melody by Thomas Tallis. And so this being a Fantasia, maybe I should talk about that before we get too deep into this, because it helps us understand Vaughan-Williams' approach to the entire idea of using somebody else's melody and making it his own composition. So where did this melody come from anyway? We know it was by Thomas Tallis. Thomas Tallis is recognized as among the greatest English musicians, English composers of history. And back in the 1500s, he was asked to write it for the Psalter of 1567. And he wrote this particular tune for Psalm number 2, a metrical version of Psalm number 2. It's in 4-part harmony, and maybe I'll have Vlad put a little clip of Tallis's original composition, so you can get an idea of where Vaughan-Williams drew his inspiration. But the melody is this. And you might notice that it sounds a little bit modal. I'll talk about the modality of it in a little bit, but that is the melody that caught Vaughan-Williams' ear. How did he end up running across this? Well, England and Great Britain is full of church history, and turns out Vaughan-Williams was the editor for the English hymnal. And as Vaughan-Williams was editing the English hymnal, he ran across this tune, which Tallis had written way back in the 1500s for the Psalter of 1567, and he liked it, and he included it in the English hymnal. So that's kind of some of the church history, church music history that's linking them all together. But it seems that Vaughan-Williams really liked this melody, and it became more than just something he put into a hymnal for all of England to sing when they go to church. He took it and turned it into this Fantasia. And the idea of Fantasia that he had in his mind was something antiphonal. Antiphony is basically the fancy term for call and response. Call and response, as we hear in rock music, as we hear in traditional music, ethnic music traditions from all parts of the world, as we hear in the spirituals and feeding into the blues tradition here in this country, in America, which then fed into rock, all of that. Call and response, or in fancy terms, antiphony. And you will hear in this piece of music an antiphonal approach, a call and response approach. And I want to show you just a little bit of the score, opening of the score, because there's something really special about it. Notice here that we have something called violin solo, etc. Basically, this is a string quartet. Violin, viola, and cello. Under that, we have another chunk called Orchestra 1. Okay, that's a string orchestra. And then another chunk we have called Orchestra 2. And that is another string orchestra. In other words, Vaughan-Williams has written this for 3 distinct instrumental groups. One string orchestra, another string orchestra, and a string quartet. Because he has formulated this with the idea of call and response, not just 2-part call and response, but even 3-part, one orchestra answering another orchestra, orchestras together, string quartet answering. You will hear this in this music. And so what's happening in the introduction, we have these lovely swaying chords and everything, and then this pizzicato moment that we just heard in the basses and strings here is the moment when we are first clued in to what is going to be the defining melodic material, music material for the entire piece. Listen again how it outlines the first few notes of what I just played on you that Thomas Tallis wrote. Okay, here's this long note up here. Dom, bom. Some more swing chords. More hints of the melody that's going to come. There's something rather ancient about it, isn't there? It's that Phrygian mode. Now the cellos are singing the melody. I love the way that as they're singing this da 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 dum, suddenly the harmony shifts, and we feel like, there's a little bit of darkness coming in there. I don't know if you noticed that, but to me, it's a very special moment as this theme, the whole musical idea of the song is being introduced to us, to our ears for the first time. Here. And then here, when the strings drop down a bit. And if you're not familiar with this piece, but you're somehow familiar with, let's say, classic Christmas season music, you might notice a little fragment of the melody there that somehow makes you think of every time. Well, I'm familiar with this piece, but still every time I hear it, somehow that little moment stands out to me as a moment of, okay, this is so steeped in English tradition, classical tradition, but at the same time, you hear the very Englishness of it. You hear the hints of English, even English folk music in there with that little fragment that just, it's so much, it belongs to the melody. It's not like he's quoting something, but still you hear something that is very much like and teases us towards Greensleeves. But then we carry into them. Okay, things are changing here. And so that is the first portion of the music, which we have this introductory material, and then the main melody starts to appear. Little hints of it, little fragments of it. And then the strings come in and they sing the entire melody so fully and basically say, it's all on the table. Now, let's start exploring it. And that's what the music ends up doing in different ways throughout the rest of the piece, is exploring this melody. It's interesting to me that this is the first piece that Vaughan-Williams wrote that music critics, music historians, the classical music world usually says, it's the first piece that he wrote that really truly sounds like himself and like nobody else. In other words, this is the piece in which he found his own voice as a composer. I guess he was in his 30s, I think, when he wrote this. And it's just swelling up to this moment. Listen to the bass there. It's giving us the anchor over which those strings can soar. Do you hear the melody in there? So even here, we are hearing we're hearing this melody from way back to Thomas Tallis' time. Notice how everything calmed down and became much more stable there. And now, this is darker. This is only one string orchestra here. Now we get to hear the talking back and forth, the call and response. And here's everybody answering. The smaller group singing something. And now you're going to hear it coming. Oh, and the basses. They say, we're going to join our voice here. Okay, there's the voice. And here you have that deep voice singing. Another burst from... And back to this. You hear so much of the call and response and the way they're working through this melody together. Da-dee-da-dum. It's still the same melody. That's this thin little spot right here, and now we're at the cellos down here. Now this viola is going to come in here. Here it is. Just rippling and swaying along. Here comes the orchestra, and everybody's going to come in here. Be ready for it. Here they come. And now we go back to the solo. This time it's a violin. Here's the Now you have two solo instruments duetting together. Now here comes a cello coming in. One of the things you might have noticed by this point in the music is we can still hear hints of that melody. Da, 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 da. But it's gotten kind of more ornate, more elaborate. And perhaps you'll say, oh, I don't know quite what to do with all this complicated melodic stuff. But I'm going to suggest to you to think again back towards rock, and even further back towards blues, where they take a simple melody. Imagine putting words to this. A simple melody, sing it, and then when it gets more complicated, think of it kind of like, let's say, the guitar solo, taking it off into something a little bit more elaborate. It's not a foreign concept. Perhaps the sonic texture is different. Maybe the rhythmic approach is different. You don't have drums thumping out the beat for us here. Instead, it's more, there's, as I said at the beginning, Vaughan-Williams has made this really have a sense of a natural swaying element to it, the swaying chords, and the way he uses pulse patterns, beat divisions, to create this atmosphere of, to me, it reminds me so much of pictures of the English countryside. The rolling hills, the trees, the little roads, the color of the grass, the fields with stone walls, those sorts of things. It feels so, might I say, romantically English, which this is kind of 20th century romantic style music, so it fits perfectly, right? But it's the sort of feeling of calm and relaxation, and at the same time complexity of the natural world. And I think if you can just walk into it and imagine yourself stepping outdoors, and you feel the breeze, and you feel the sunshine, and you feel the moisture in the air, and you hear the birds, and you see the grass swaying in the breeze, and the all the little insects. It's an incredibly complex experience when we step out the door in a rural or semi-rural setting. And this music manages to capture that and convey that, doesn't it? Also notice how much of it is about melody. You notice how much I notice melody when I listen to rock music? Now, one of the things that I want to talk about, I promised to talk about, is the mode. I said this is in Phrygian mode. Which mode is that? Well, if we set ourselves in the key of C, pretend we're in the key of C. This is our major scale, right? Now, if we go up to the third degree of the scale, E, and we start ourselves here, that is the Phrygian mode. It has a sort of minor quality because the third is a minor third. But there's also something kind of open about it. And there's this middle part which feels very bright and open and major, although this is the fourth degree. Surprises us, doesn't it? Because in a major scale, we're used to hearing a narrow space between the third and fourth. But here, it's a wide space between these two. So it sets us up feeling kind of minor, rather subdued. But then suddenly opening up, big, wide, free. And it's not the most commonly used mode. It's not a mode that's most commonly used. It's a mode that is one of the lesser common ones, especially during the span of time between Thomas Tallis and Vaughan-Williams. So the fact that he picked up on this particular mode and embraced it and used this melody at this time, it signals kind of the way that music was opening up in the 20th century, even in the classical era, in the classical tradition, and the way composers were looking for new sonic experiences, new ways of handling music. And it's also one of the things that makes it feel perhaps less familiar, it's easier for us to kind of hark back to ancient times because it was commonly used back then, much more so than now. I did a little kind of search to see how much does this Phrygian mode appear in rock music and in modern contemporary music. And even now, not very much. The only place where I could find that it's really common, has been embraced, it seems to be in the really strong, heavy metal, dark metal genres, where one person said it has kind of become the sound of volume. In fact, they said the Phrygian mode is changing the way loud sounds, because it seems that certain metal genres and listening communities have really embraced that as a powerful sound. Isn't this so incredibly delicate and subtle? And it reminds us that just because something is heard in one genre doesn't mean that it can't be applied in a completely different way to beautiful effect. And it's one of the things that makes this piece so distinctive. So just keeping that in mind as we go through and we hear this melody, which could be so mournful. But instead, when we get this lift that happens in the melody, it seems to kind of tease our modern Western ears and say it's supposed to be sad, but it's not sad. It's melancholy, but it's not melancholy. It's free, but it's not brash. There's something, I think it's one of the things that also helps it feel so akin to at least to me, it feels so akin to the natural world, stepping outside and just feeling the life around you that's growing and the whole environment of that. It sounds so bright here. The soaring melody that just, it's like watching a bird in flight. The way those cellos swell up to that point. You just have to get lost in it and let yourself be carried along. The small ensemble. The other instruments answering back. Everybody, voices together for a moment. You hear that cello line weaving its way down, and everybody jumps in again, says we can't contain ourselves, we need to join our voices to the celebration. And it gets bigger and stronger. And again. Coming back down, settling down, but something comes from underneath. And the emphasis, the celebratory emphasis, the throwing your heart and soul into singing these lines. Imagine for a moment that you were listening to a choir. Let's say even something different. Let's say something in the sort of African-rooted call and response tradition. Imagine that these are voices. Imagine that there's a little bit of percussion here. African style, traditional percussion. And imagine that when this whole orchestra is swelling together, this is the whole group of voices. But then you hear these free lines out sung by, somebody in the group who does the traditional call and response, an elaboration on ideas that happens spontaneously sometimes, and that is so iconic to that musical tradition. And try to imagine this in that way, just as a way of taking a new listening approach and saying, how does this affect my perception of this music? Everybody together, pretty much in unison, rhythmically. They're all singing the same words at the same time, homophonically. Emphasized here. down together. Calming down. The imaginative percussion is diminishing. Now you hear just a bit of it. One of the groups is humming. A burst from everybody. A little bit over together, laid upon each other. And now listen. Here comes the melody again. And here's a solo voice that is just elaborately soaring to the top. But you can hear that melody way up there singing along. And notice that there is this counter melody here. This is one of the moments where suddenly we have, as earlier in the piece, it's kind of a duet moment. Everybody together! Getting softer again. Just one group, one orchestra. Some motion here. You hear it sung way down in do 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 do. More voices coming in again, singing a kind of shape of the melody. You can hear the whole group settling down, getting anchored on some deep notes here. Here comes the melody again. A little bit of final frenzy here. And then very peacefully, before the applause breaks the spell. That last chord is very special because we've been through this whole journey and we've had all this intense interaction between the different instrumental groups and sections and the way the melody has been passed around and sung and shaped and handled by the different groups, by the music. And sometimes very elaborately, sometimes very much as one throughout all the different parts. Sometimes different competing or contributing voices here, there, everywhere. And then we get to the end, and there's this final intense passionate singing, all the voices together, da, 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 very emphatic. And then this violin steps in and brings down the temperature just a little bit as he soars up and hovers on these last notes. And as he brings us towards the final chord, I mentioned how this piece has kind of a minor quality because of the mode it's in. And then, as we come to the end, this minor quality is suddenly brightened by the insertion of a B natural. And everything ends on a major chord with this big, strong swell into that major chord, which then fades away and leaves us there just treasuring that moment. It's like we've been surveying all the surrounding countryside around us, and then suddenly maybe the sun rises enough to come streaming over the hills, or perhaps the clouds break open just enough to let the sunlight come streaming through, and there's this incredible sense of what a golden moment. So here we are, building up to the top. Okay, everybody's getting ready to come in here. Just a moment. Once we reach the peak here, finish. Here it comes. That line at the top. Moving up. Harmony here. Very gentle. Trickling away. Up, higher and higher. And here we come singing this melody once more time. Everyone, passionately together, come on, sing it on. And here, bringing it down to the last fine thread. Here comes the chord, listen for it. Fade away, let it fade. That's the sunlight. Somebody wants to clap, but not yet. Don't break the spell. Ah. It is a beautiful piece of music. But there are lots of beautiful pieces of classical music. Why this one here? Well, as I said, it covers so much of history, music history, in such an English way. What are some of the links that I hear in this with much of the rock music? As I said, there's the call and response element, which is such a big part of this piece of music, and which is such an important part of the rock music tradition as well. Sonically, music color-wise, does this have much in common with the rock music that I've been exploring over the past several years? And if I were going to connect this sound to something I've heard in the rock world, I have to say that the closest thing I can come up with would be Brian May's guitar choruses. Think of how those sound, and think of how these string orchestras and string groups here have a similar kind of incredible energy and warmth and color and the harmonic richness of the music. There's not that much difference between some of what Brian May did with Queen and this. And then think also of the fact that this is so, as I said, so traditionally churched English in its origins. And the fact that, well, England was a very churched nation, even in the 1970s, right? And think about Paul McCartney growing up in the Anglican tradition and singing as a choir boy and hearing the music, which we hear hints of it coming out in his Beatles output. Isn't it fascinating to recognize that the composer of this piece of music died just 2 years before the Beatles became the Beatles. And already the Beatles guys, before they were the Beatles, were playing together before he died. So there's this very close connection chronologically, time-wise, but also this melody is one that McCartney would have heard in his growing up years. There are many more connections than we might imagine if we just look at the surface. But if we start digging deeper, we realize, oh wow, there are a lot of connections there. And as I was having you play that game of, imagine if this were an African style singing piece of music, you can hear it. It's embedded in the music. There's so much of this that exists in so many parts of the music. And it's a beautiful thing to start making these connections and recognizing that, okay, maybe I like something with a more driving rhythm. Maybe I like something with a more meaty electric guitar sound. Or maybe I like this. But it doesn't matter. It's all music. And there are so many links from one to the next. And while you can't necessarily say this is like such and such Beatles piece of music, because it's not. At the same time, you can say there are elements here which are held in common across these different genres and different time spans and all of that. So it's a beautiful piece, and one that I hope you enjoyed exploring in this way. And I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts, and I would love to hear you share your listening experience of this song and the way you hear it. And perhaps you might also think of some other links, some other common threads, common strands between this piece and some of the other music that we focus on this channel. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about your listening experience. I'll see you soon.